That morning, Clara Ainsworth learned everything. She learned it not in a solicitor's office, choked with the dust of bad news, nor in a quiet, tearful confession from her father. She learned it in the drawing room, from the tight, brittle way her mother held a teacup, her knuckles white as bone china. The Duke of Blackwood has made a most generous offer, her father, Lord Ainsworth, announced to the floral pattern on the carpet. He could not meet her eye. He had not been able to meet her eye for a fortnight. Clara sat very still on the chaise longue, her hands folded over a book she was no longer reading. The words had been swimming for an hour, ever since her father had summoned her with a clipped, formal note, a thing he had never done. A duke, an offer, generous. The words were simple, but they landed in the quiet room like stones, each one chipping away at the fragile piece of her world. "What sort of offer?" Clara asked. Her voice was steady. It was a small point of pride, that steadiness. It was the only thing she truly owned. Her mother set down her teacup with a clatter that betrayed her carefully composed facade. "Clara, darling, it is a marriage proposal." A proposal from a man she had never met, a duke. The Duke of Blackwood was a name spoken in hushed, almost fearful tones in London. Impossibly wealthy, impossibly powerful, and impossibly cold. A man who moved through the glittering ballrooms of the Tun like a ghost, his presence a dark, unyielding judgment on the frivolity around him. He was 32, they said, and had shown no inclination toward marriage. "I see," Clara said. And she did. She saw the frayed cuffs on her father's coat, the careful way her mother mended and remended the household linens, the dwindling number of servants. She saw the fear that had been living behind her father's eyes for months, the ghost of the gaming tables at White's. "He has agreed," Lord Ainsworth said, finally looking at her, his face a mask of shame and desperate relief, "to settle all of our accounts, in full." There it was, the price tag. She was not being courted, she was being sold. A transaction, neat and tidy. Her life, her future, her name, in exchange for a stack of paid-up vouchers and the restoration of her father's hollowed-out honor. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were exactly what her father expected, a feminine weakness that would allow him to feel both guilt and a strange sort of paternal authority in comforting her. She would not give him the satisfaction. Instead, she stood up, her spine as straight as a steel rod. The book in her lap fell to the floor with a soft thud. No one moved to pick it up. "When am I to meet him?" she asked. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon. Clara wore her best gown, a simple grey muslin that had been her best gown for 2 seasons. It had been refitted once, the seams let out with painstaking care by her own hands. It was the dress of a respectable, intelligent woman. It was not the dress of a future duchess. She did not care. This was not a courtship. It was an inspection. She would present herself as she was, unadorned, solvent in spirit, if not in coin. The Duke of Blackwood arrived precisely at 3. He was taller than she had imagined, a figure of stark lines and dark colours. His coat was perfectly tailored, his cravat a study in severe, mathematical perfection. But it was his face that held her. It was a face of angles and shadows, dominated by eyes the colour of a winter storm. They were not cruel eyes, she noted with a strange, detached part of her mind. They were simply empty, as if all the feeling had been leached out of them long ago. He bowed. It was a correct, dismissive gesture. "Miss Ainsworth." "Your Grace," she replied, Her curtsy just as correct, just as cool. The air in the room was thick with unspoken things. Her father hovered, sweating slightly, trying to fill the silence with bluff, hearty pronouncements about the weather. Her mother offered tea, her voice trembling. The Duke ignored them both, his gaze fixed on Clara. It was not a look of admiration. It was not even a look of assessment. It was the look of a man examining a piece of property he was considering acquiring. He was checking for flaws, for structural weaknesses. "My man of business has spoken with your fathers," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing that seemed to absorb the light in the room. "The terms are, I believe, agreeable." The terms? Her. She was the terms. "Yes, Your Grace. Entirely agreeable," her father blustered. Clara met the Duke's gaze directly. "The terms are agreeable to my father, Your Grace. He is the one with the debts. I am merely the currency." A flicker. Something moved in the depths of those stormy eyes. It was not anger. It was not surprise. It was recognition. As if he had seen something he had not expected. A spine where he had anticipated a swoon. He was silent for a long moment. 1 second. 2 seconds. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked, each sound an impossibly loud indictment of the shabby gentility of the room. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Indeed," he said, and to her astonishment, he spoke to her, and her alone. "The marriage will take place by special license in 3 days' time. We will reside in London until the end of the season. My grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, will call on you tomorrow to assist with your preparations." He said the word preparations as if it were a distasteful but necessary chore, like hiring a new stable master. It was clear what he meant. He was buying a duchess, and she did not look the part. He intended to rectify that. Clara inclined her head. "You are very efficient, Your Grace." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the almost. "I find it saves a great deal of time." He turned to leave, his business concluded. At the door, he paused and looked back, his gaze once again finding hers over the heads of her relieved, fawning parents. "Miss Ainsworth," he said, and for the first time his voice held a trace of something other than cold finality. A warning, perhaps. "I do not require a love match. I do not require a companion. I require a duchess. One who understands her duties, maintains her dignity, and does not cause scandal. Can you be that woman?" It was a challenge. A strange, starkly honest question in a room built on lies and desperation. She did not hesitate. "I can," she said. And he was gone. The Dowager Duchess, Augusta Sterling, was nothing like her grandson. Where he was a figure of storm and shadow, she was all sharp, glittering wit. She arrived the next day, like a galleon in full sail, her silks rustling, her diamonds winking in the dim light of the Ainsworth drawing room. She was a woman of 70, with eyes that missed nothing and a tongue that spared no one. She took one look at Clara's grey muslin, another at the worn furniture, and a third at Clara's face. "So," she said, her voice crisp, "you're the one. Good spine. I'll give you that. My grandson has the discernment of a turnip, but he appears to have stumbled into acquiring a woman with a backbone. A novelty for him." Clara found herself liking the old woman instantly. "My grandson is a fool," the Dowager continued, settling herself into a chair that groaned in protest. "But he is my fool, and you are to be his duchess, which means we have a great deal of work to do, and very little time." The next 2 days were a whirlwind. Modistes and milliners, Glovers and shoemakers all descended upon the house, summoned by the dowager's brisk notes. Gowns were commissioned, fittings were endured. Clara felt like a doll being dressed and undressed, a silent mannequin upon which the wealth of the Duke of Blackwood was being draped. Through it all, she remained quiet, observant. She saw the pity in the eyes of some of the shop girls, the envy in others. She saw the triumphant relief on her mother's face, the way her father was already walking taller, the spectre of the bailiffs banished from his door. She was their salvation, and their cage was her own. The wedding itself was a cold, brief affair at St. George's, Hanover Square, with only her parents and the Dowager Duchess in attendance. Alexander stood beside her at the altar, a remote, handsome stranger in formal attire. He spoke his vows in a clear, low voice, as if reciting the terms of a contract. Clara spoke hers in a voice that did not tremble. When he placed the ring on her finger, his hand was cool, his touch impersonal. It was a heavy ring, a band of gold so old it seemed to have its own history, its own weight. She was now the Duchess of Blackwood. It felt no different from being Clara Ainsworth, only heavier. They rode back to Blackwood House, the Duke's London residence, in a silence as profound as a tomb. The house was magnificent, a palace of marble and gilt on Grosvenor Square. Servants lined the hall, their faces impassive. The housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Thorne, greeted them with a stiff curtsy. "Welcome home, Your Grace." "Your Grace," she said, her eyes flicking to Clara for a brief, unreadable moment. That night, Alexander showed her to her rooms. They were a suite, in fact, connected by a dressing room to his own. He paused at the door. "These are your chambers," he said. "If you require anything, Mrs. Thorne will see to it. I trust you will find them adequate." "I am sure I will," Clara said, her voice quiet. He hesitated. For a moment, she thought he might say something more, something personal, something to acknowledge the enormity of what had just happened. They were husband and wife. He did not. He simply nodded. "Good night, Duchess." And he closed the door between their chambers, leaving her alone in the opulent, gilded cage he had bought for her. The first week of her marriage was a lesson in invisibility. Alexander was a phantom in his own home. He rose early, spent his days at his clubs or in his study with his man of business, and often dined out. They saw each other occasionally, in passing, exchanging polite, meaningless greetings in the vast hallways of Blackwood House. He did not look guilty. That was what she noticed most sharply. He did not look like a man who had bought a wife to solve a family's financial crisis. He looked like a man who had concluded a necessary but uninteresting piece of business, and had already moved on to other, more important matters. It was the Dowager who saved her from disappearing entirely. Augusta insisted on taking Clara out, on presenting her to the Ton. "You are the Duchess of Blackwood now," she said firmly. "You will not be permitted to hide in the library like a timid mouse. You will hold your head high, and you will make them respect you." Respect, Clara thought, was a difficult thing to command when everyone knew your price. The whispers followed her everywhere, as subtle and as persistent as the rustle of silk. She saw the glances, the speculative looks, the women who smiled at her with their mouths but not their eyes. They knew. Of course, they knew. Her father's ruin had not been a secret, merely a topic for gossip. The Duke's sudden marriage, his settling of the Ainsworth debts, it was a story too delicious for the Ton to ignore. She bore it all with the same quiet dignity that had become her armor. She smiled. She nodded. She made polite conversation. She was a perfect duchess, on the surface. Inside, she was a stone. Then came the invitation. The Duchess of Devonshire's annual ball, the glittering pinnacle of the London season. It was not a request. It was a command. The new Duchess of Blackwood was expected to attend, on her husband's arm. "I will be occupied with business until late," Alexander told her that morning, in one of their rare conversations over a breakfast table, so long they might as well have been in separate postcodes. "I will meet you there. The Dowager will escort you." He did not want to be seen arriving with her. The thought was a small, sharp sting. He would do his duty, but he would not pretend to enjoy it. Clara simply nodded. "As you wish, Your Grace." That evening, she dressed with care. The Dowager had insisted on a new gown, a creation of shimmering silver silk that fell in a clean, elegant line. It was not fussy or overly adorned. It was a gown that spoke of wealth and status without shouting it. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger, a woman of grace and power, her dark hair swept up, a simple string of Blackwood diamonds at her throat. For a fleeting moment, she felt a spark of something that might have been confidence. The ball was a crushing assault on the senses. The heat of 1,000 candles, the overwhelming scent of perfume and wilting flowers, the roar of conversation and music. Devonshire House was packed, a sea of jewels and silk and ambition. The Dowager, a formidable escort, steered Clara through the throng, introducing her with a proud, defiant air. "My granddaughter, the Duchess of Blackwood." Clara smiled until her face ached. She exchanged pleasantries with people whose names she immediately forgot. She felt like an actress in a play for which she had not learned the lines. Everyone was watching her. She was the curiosity of the season, the impoverished gentlewoman who had somehow snared the great unattainable Duke of Blackwood. The charity bride, she found a small alcove behind a potted palm, a temporary refuge from the relentless scrutiny. She needed a moment to breathe, to gather her composure. The silver silk of her gown felt like a costume, the diamonds at her neck a heavy, cold weight. And then she heard the voices. They were low, but sharp with malice, carrying easily in a brief lull in the music. Can you believe the nerve? Parading her about as if she were a true lady. The voice belonged to Lady Beatrice Finch, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her venom. She was the acknowledged queen of a small, vicious circle of gossips. "Well, what can you expect?" Another voice chimed in. "They say her father was a step away from debtor's prison. Blackwood didn't just buy her a new gown. He bought the entire family." "I heard," Lady Beatrice said, her voice dripping with amusement, "that he refers to it as his Ainsworth acquisition. A bit of prime stock to ensure the succession. Nothing more." A cruel little laugh. The Duke's charity bride. How utterly pathetic. The words struck Clara with physical force. She felt the air leave her lungs. She had known they were thinking it. She had known they were whispering it behind their fans. But to hear it spoken aloud, so casually, so cruelly, it was like a slap in the face. She did not cry. Her pride, that stubborn, foolish thing, would not allow it. But she could not move. She was frozen behind the palm, a statue in silver silk, the laughter of the women echoing in her ears. She felt a presence behind her, a shadow falling over her. She thought it was a footman, and her mortification deepened. but it was not a footman. Lady Beatrice. The voice was ice. It cut through the warm, cloying air of the ballroom, silencing the chatter, the laughter, everything. Clara turned slowly. Alexander stood there, the Duke of Blackwood. He had arrived. He had heard. He was not looking at Clara. His gaze, those storm-grey eyes, now arctic with a terrifying, controlled fury, was fixed on the small group of women. Lady Beatrice Finch had gone pale, her painted smile frozen on her face. "Your Grace," she stammered, attempting a curtsy. You were just, what?" Alexander's voice was dangerously quiet. "Sharing your particular brand of wit? I find it lacking." He took a step forward, and the women instinctively shrank back. He was no longer the aloof, remote duke. He was a predator, and they were his prey. He was close enough to hear every word, and he did not stay silent. "Let me be exceptionally clear," he said, his voice carrying to the surrounding guests, who had fallen silent, all eyes on the unfolding drama. "You are speaking of my wife, the Duchess of Blackwood, a woman whose grace, intelligence, and dignity are so far beyond your comprehension that you can do nothing but attempt to tear her down." He took another step, his gaze sweeping over Lady Beatrice and her companions. "Her father's finances are no concern of yours. The circumstances of our marriage are no concern of yours. But her honour," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout, "is my concern, and you will not besmirch it. Not in my hearing." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. "You find her position pathetic?" he continued, a note of pure derision in his tone. "I find your jealousy pathetic. You find her a charity case? I find her a treasure I was fortunate enough to acquire." The word acquire was the same one he had used before, but now he wielded it like a weapon, turning their own insult back on them. "She is the Duchess of Blackwood, and you will address her with the respect she is owed. Or you will find that the social circles of London have become remarkably small." It was a threat, cold and unmistakable. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He could ruin them with a word. He turned his back on them, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He walked the few steps to the alcove where Clara still stood, frozen. He did not look angry anymore. He looked weary. He held out his arm. "Duchess," he said, his voice once again low, but this time for her ears only. "I believe this is our dance." She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. She saw the man who had just defended her, publicly, ruthlessly, the man who had called her a treasure, the man who had stood between her and the cruelty of the world. She placed her hand on his arm. His touch was firm, steady. As he led her out of the alcove and onto the dance floor, the whispers started again. But they were different now. They were whispers of awe, of fear, of grudging respect. The orchestra began a waltz. He took her in his arms, his hand firm at the small of her back. They began to move, two solitary figures in the center of a sea of watching eyes. He did not smile. He did not say a word. But as they danced, for the first time since she had become the Duchess of Blackwood, Clara felt as though she might not be entirely alone. The man who had bought her had just, in front of the entire world, claimed her as his own. And it changed everything. "We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." The carriage ride home was a study in silence. It was not the empty, indifferent silence of their previous encounters. This was a silence thick with the unspoken, charged with the energy of the explosion at the ball. Clara sat on her side, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the silver silk of her gown a cool weight against her skin. She kept replaying the scene in her mind. His voice, like ice. The shock on Lady Beatrice's face. The way the entire ballroom had held its breath. Alexander sat opposite her, a figure carved from shadow and moonlight. He stared out the window at the passing gaslights of London, his jaw tight, his profile severe. She could not read his expression. Was he angry, regretful of his outburst, mortified to be shackled to a woman who had caused such a scene, even if she was the victim of it? She had to say something. The silence was becoming unbearable. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He did not turn from the window. For a moment, she thought he hadn't heard her. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "For what? Doing my duty? You are my Duchess. An insult to you is an insult to my name." It was a cold, pragmatic explanation. It should have chilled her. It should have reminded her of the transactional nature of their relationship. But it didn't, because she had seen his eyes at the ball. That had not been the cool calculation of a man protecting his name. That had been fury, raw, personal fury. "Nevertheless," she said, a little stronger this time, "you did not have to be so thorough." At this, he finally turned to look at her. In the flickering gloom of the carriage, his eyes seemed impossibly dark. "They deserved it," he said, the words clipped. "And more." He lapsed back into silence, but the tension had shifted. It was no longer a chasm between them, but a shared, vibrating space. He had defended her. He had stood with her. It was a foundation, however small and uncertain, on which something might be built. When the carriage drew to a stop before the imposing facade of Blackwood House, he did not wait for the footman. He opened the door himself and stepped out, then turned and offered her his hand. It was the first time he had done so. A small courtesy, but it felt significant. His grip was strong, his hand warm. Inside the great hall, the servants were gone, the house quiet and asleep. A single lamp burned, casting long shadows on the marble floor. "I find I have lost my taste for London," Alexander said abruptly, turning to face her. "The air has become stale." Clara waited. "We will leave for Northwood in the morning," he announced. It was not a suggestion. "Have your maid pack what you will need for the summer." Northwood, his country seat, a place spoken of with reverence, a vast estate in Northumberland, far from the petty cruelties of the ton. He was not just leaving London. He was taking her with him. He was removing her from the battlefield, placing her in sanctuary. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "Alexander," he said, the name dropping into the silence between them. She looked up, startled. "My name is Alexander," he repeated, his expression unreadable. "In private, you will call me Alexander." It was another shift, another piece of the foundation settling into place. "Alexander," she tried. The name felt strange on her tongue, too intimate for the stranger before her. And yet, it also felt right. Something flickered in his eyes. "Good night, Clara." He had used her given name. He had never used it before. He turned and ascended the grand staircase without another word, leaving her standing alone in the hall. The echo of her own name, a quiet, startling warmth in the cold, magnificent house. The journey north was long, and on the surface, uneventful. They travelled in the Duke's large, well-sprung coach, with Clara's new lady's maid, a quiet, efficient girl named Sarah, riding with them. For the first day, the silence of the carriage ride from the ball seemed to have returned. Alexander read a book of what looked like political treatises, his face a mask of concentration. Clara watched the green, rolling countryside of England unfold, a landscape she had not seen since her childhood. But small things began to happen. At the coaching inn, where they stopped for lunch, he noticed her shiver in the draughty common room, and, without a word, took the travelling rug from his own shoulders and draped it over hers. It was a simple, automatic gesture, but it was an act of consideration. He had noticed her. He had seen her discomfort and acted to alleviate it. Later that afternoon, the coach hit a rut, and Clara was thrown forward. He reached out, his hand catching her arm to steady her, his grip firm and sure. His touch lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before he drew back, his gaze quickly returning to his book. But she had felt it, the warmth of his skin through the fabric of her sleeve, the latent strength in his hand. They were small moments, almost nothing. But for Clara, who had been starved of any genuine human connection for so long, they were everything. They were tiny cracks appearing in the icy facade of the Duke of Blackwood. On the evening of the second day, they arrived at Northwood. As the carriage crested a hill, Clara caught her first glimpse of it. It was not a house, it was a kingdom, a sprawling edifice of grey stone that seemed to have grown from the very land itself, nestled in a valley and flanked by ancient, brooding forests. It was magnificent, but there was a wildness to it, a sense of untamed power that was both intimidating and beautiful. It was, she thought, a perfect reflection of its master. As they drew up the long, winding drive, she saw that the house, for all its grandeur, showed signs of neglect. A shutter hung slightly askew. The gardens were overgrown in places, the stone weathered and stained with lichen. It had the air of a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time. The staff was assembled on the steps, a small army of servants, headed by a stern-looking butler and a housekeeper who looked even more formidable than Mrs. Thorne in London. They all bowed and curtsied as Alexander helped her from the coach. "Welcome to Northwood, Your Grace." "Your Grace," the butler intoned. Alexander merely nodded, his gaze sweeping over the house, his expression grim. "See that the Duchess's things are taken to her chambers, Poole. We will require a light supper in an hour." He led her inside. The great hall was even more vast than the one in London, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, its walls hung with faded tapestries and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. A fire roared in a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, but it did little to dispel the chill in the air. The house felt sad. That night, she was shown to a suite of rooms in the east wing. They were beautiful, furnished with exquisite antiques and silks, but they felt cold and impersonal. She noticed, with a now familiar pang of disappointment, that they were even further from Alexander's chambers than they had been in London. Here, an entire corridor separated them. He was retreating again, putting distance between them. The fragile connection forged on the journey north already seemed to be dissolving. The first few weeks at Northwood were lonely. Alexander disappeared into the business of his estate. He was gone from dawn until dusk, riding out with his steward, meeting with tenants, poring over ledgers and maps in his study. He was a different man here. In London, he had been an aloof aristocrat. Here, he was a working laird, a man bound by duty to his land and his people. He joined her for dinner each evening, but their meals were formal, strained affairs at either end of a ridiculously long dining table. They spoke of the weather, of the estate, of inconsequential things. The man who had defended her so fiercely at the ball, the man who had called her by her given name, was gone, replaced once more by the cold, remote Duke of Blackwood. Clara felt the old invisibility creeping back. She was a duchess in name only, a ghost haunting the grand, empty rooms of Northwood. But this time, something was different. She was not the frightened, desperate girl who had been sold into marriage. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. This was her home now, and she would not be a ghost in it. She started with the dining room. One afternoon, she sought out the housekeeper, Mrs. Graves. "Mrs. Graves," she began, her heart beating a little faster. "I find the dining table rather large for just 2 people. Could we not take our meals at the smaller table in the breakfast room?" Mrs. Graves, a woman who looked as if she had been carved from the same granite as the house, looked at her with surprise. "The late Duke and Duchess always dined in the great hall, Your Grace." "I am not the late Duchess," Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. "And the Duke and I are not the late Duke and Duchess. The breakfast room, if you please." Mrs. Graves blinked. Then, for the first time, a flicker of something like approval crossed her face. "Very good, Your Grace." That evening, when Alexander entered the breakfast room for dinner, he stopped short. The room was cozier, a fire crackling in the hearth. A small round table was set for 2 near the window, which overlooked the darkening gardens. It was intimate. It was normal. He looked at Clara, a question in his eyes. "I hope you do not mind, Your Grace," she said, her voice calm. "I thought this might be more comfortable." He did not answer immediately. He walked to the table, pulled out her chair for her, and then took his own seat. The space between them was no longer a vast expanse of polished mahogany. He was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his grey eyes, the tiny lines of fatigue around them. "It is," he said finally, his voice quiet. "More comfortable." They ate in a silence that was, for the first time, not strained, but companionable. It was a small victory, but it was a start. Clara began to explore her new domain. She discovered the library. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories high, with towering shelves filled with thousands of books. It was the heart of the house, and it had been neglected. A fine layer of dust covered everything, and the air was stale. She found a set of keys and let herself in. And she began to work. She opened the windows, letting in the fresh country air. She found dusters and cloths, and began the slow, methodical process of cleaning. She ran her fingers over the leather-bound spines, discovering treasures. Poetry, philosophy, history, travelogues. A collection that spoke of generations of curious, intelligent minds. She was there one afternoon, perched on a ladder, reaching for a volume on the top shelf, when the door opened. She turned, startled, and saw Alexander standing there. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. He had clearly just come in from riding. His boots were spattered with mud, and his hair was wind-tousled. He looked more vital, more alive than she had ever seen him. "What are you doing?" he asked. The library was in need of airing, she said simply, her perch on the ladder suddenly feeling precarious. He walked into the room, his gaze sweeping over the open windows, the stacks of books she had begun to sort and catalogue. He stopped before a table where she had laid out a collection of botanical prints she had found. "My mother collected these," he said, his voice quiet. He traced the delicate lines of a primrose with his finger. She loved the gardens. It was the first time he had mentioned his mother, the late Duchess. "They are beautiful," Clara said. He looked up at her, and the mask was gone. For a fleeting moment, she saw not the Duke of Blackwood, but a man shadowed by a deep, abiding grief. "She died when I was 16. The house has not been the same since." And there it was, the explanation, the neglect, the sadness, the cold, empty rooms. The house was not just holding its breath. It was in mourning, and so was its master. He had been in mourning for 16 years. "I'm sorry," she said, the words inadequate. He seemed to shake himself, the mask slipping back into place, but not as securely as before. "It was a long time ago." He looked back at her on the ladder. "Be careful," he said. "That rung is loose." He turned and left as abruptly as he had arrived. Clara stayed on the ladder for a long time after he was gone. He had shared something with her, a piece of his past, a piece of his pain, and he had warned her about the loose rung. He was starting to see her, not as the Duchess, not as a term of his bargain, but as a person, as Clara. A few days later, the Dowager Duchess arrived at Northwood, sweeping in with her usual whirlwind of energy and sharp observations. She took one look at the newly cleaned library, the cozier dining arrangements, and the subtle but definite changes in the atmosphere of the house, and she smiled. "Well, well," she said to Clara, tapping her on the arm with her fan. "It seems you are not a mouse after all, more of a house cat, quietly making the place your own." Augusta's presence seemed to relax Alexander. He smiled more in her company, the lines of his face softening. One evening, after dinner, the three of them sat in the library, Clara's library, as he had started to call it. The Dowager was recounting a scandalous story from her youth, and to Clara's utter astonishment, Alexander laughed. It was not a grand, booming laugh, but a low, rusty sound, as if the mechanism for it had not been used in years. But it was genuine, and it was beautiful. Clara felt a strange, unfamiliar fluttering in her chest. She looked at him, at this stranger she was married to, and felt a wave of something warm and protective. She wanted to make him laugh again. She began to take an interest in the estate beyond the house. Accompanied by the Dowager, she started visiting the tenant farms and the village. She listened to the farmers' concerns about the new enclosures, to the women's worries about a fever that had taken hold in one of the cottages. She learned their names, the names of their children. She did not do it to play the grand lady. She did it because she was practical. A healthy, prosperous tenancy meant a healthy, prosperous estate. It was common sense. But it was more than that. She found she cared. She remembered what it was like to worry about making ends meet, to feel the cold hand of poverty at the door. She spoke to Alexander about what she had seen. She didn't make demands. She simply reported. "The roof at the Miller cottage is leaking badly. Their youngest has a cough. The widow Hemlock's fence was broken by the storm. Her sheep keep wandering onto the road." He would listen, his expression thoughtful, and say little. But the next day, she would hear that a cart of tiles had been dispatched to the Miller cottage, or that 2 estate workers had been sent to mend the widow's fence. He was listening, and he was acting. They were becoming a partnership. Unspoken, unacknowledged, but a partnership nonetheless. One afternoon, she was walking in the overgrown rose garden, a place that had clearly once been his mother's pride. She was trying to identify a particularly stubborn weed when he appeared, walking toward her down the gravel path. "The roses have been neglected," he said, stopping beside her. "They are resilient," she replied, looking at a single, perfect crimson bloom that had fought its way through a thicket of thorns. "They just need some care." He looked not at the rose, but at her. The afternoon sun caught in her hair, turning the dark strands to threads of auburn. She was wearing a simple day dress, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was not the pale, frozen Duchess from the London ballroom. She was vibrant, alive. She was beautiful. "Clara," he said, his voice low. She looked up at him, and she saw it. The hunger, the longing, the years of tightly controlled emotion threatening to break free. It was all there, in the stormy depths of his eyes. Her heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Alexander," she whispered, the name a breath of air. He took a step closer. He raised his hand, as if to touch her face, his fingers trembling slightly. The air crackled between them. This was it. The moment everything would change. Then, from the direction of the house, a voice called out, "Your Grace, a carriage is approaching." The moment was broken. The spell shattered. Alexander dropped his hand, a shuttered expression falling over his face. The Duke of Blackwood was back. "It seems we have visitors," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. They walked back to the house in silence. A grand, unfamiliar carriage was pulling up the drive. As a footman opened the door, a woman stepped out. A woman of striking beauty and fashionable attire, a malicious, triumphant smile playing on her lips. It was Lady Beatrice Finch. Lady Beatrice's arrival shattered the fragile peace of Northwood. She descended upon the house like a blight, accompanied by two of her equally vacuous friends, claiming they were on a tour of the North and simply had to call upon the dear Duke and his new Duchess. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. She had come for a rematch. "My dear Duchess," she cooed, taking Clara's hand in a grip that was surprisingly strong. "How lovely to see you looking so rustic. The country air certainly agrees with you." The compliment was an insult, her eyes sweeping over Clara's simple gown with disdain. Clara felt a familiar cold dread creep into her stomach. But then she looked past Lady Beatrice and saw Alexander. He was watching her, his expression a mixture of anger and a strange sort of anticipation. He was not going to rescue her this time. He was waiting to see what she would do. And in that moment, something shifted in Clara. She was not the terrified girl in the alcove anymore. This was her house, her home. She smiled, a calm, serene smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Lady Beatrice, how kind of you to visit. It is always a pleasure to welcome guests from London. It reminds us of what we are so happy to have left behind." The barb was subtle, but it hit its mark. A flicker of annoyance crossed Lady Beatrice's perfect features. The dowager, who had appeared as if by magic at Clara's elbow, let out a small, appreciative cough. The next few days were a battle of wills, fought with polite smiles and coded insults. Lady Beatrice and her friends treated Northwood as their personal playground. They were loud, demanding, and openly critical of the house's shabby state. They tried to draw Clara into their vapid conversations about fashion and gossip, their questions laced with condescension. "Don't you miss the balls, Duchess? It must be dreadfully dull up here with only the sheep for company." "I find the company of sheep far more honest and considerably less demanding," Clara replied evenly, not looking up from the estate ledger she was reviewing. They tried to get a rise out of her, to make her reveal herself as the common, impoverished girl they believed her to be. They mocked her interest in the estate, her conversations with the housekeeper, her visits to the tenants. "I saw the Duchess actually speaking to a farmer today," one of them giggled over tea, as if she knew the first thing about agriculture. A knowledge of agriculture is essential when one is responsible for the land and the people who work it, Clara said, her voice cool. "It is a far more useful skill than, say, mastering the art of the malicious rumor." Alexander remained a silent observer. He was polite, a perfect host on the surface, but Clara could feel the storm gathering behind his eyes. He watched her, his gaze intense. He saw her parry every thrust with a quiet grace that was more effective than any angry outburst. She did not stoop to their level. She simply rose above it. The climax came during a dinner party. The local gentry had been invited to meet the new Duchess, and Lady Beatrice saw it as her stage. She had been drinking more wine than was proper, and her malice had become less subtle. The conversation had turned to the improvements Clara had begun to make around the estate. The local squire was praising her efforts in organizing a new village school. "Our Duchess has a true gift for charity," he boomed appreciatively. Lady Beatrice seized the word like a weapon. "Oh, yes," she said, her voice carrying across the table. "The Duchess is well acquainted with charity. Weren't we just saying, Your Grace?" She turned to Alexander, her smile sharp and dangerous. "That your marriage was the most profound act of charity the Tun has seen in years." The table fell silent. The local guests looked confused, sensing the undercurrent of malice, but not understanding its source. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. It was the ballroom all over again, the same insult, delivered with even more venom. She looked at Alexander. His face was granite. He placed his knife and fork down on his plate with a quiet, deliberate click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. But before he could speak, Clara found her voice. She turned her head and looked directly at Lady Beatrice, a look of calm, almost clinical pity on her face. "Lady Beatrice," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "You seem to be under a misapprehension. You mistake a business transaction for charity. My father had debts. The Duke had a need for a wife. An arrangement was made that was mutually beneficial. It was a matter of commerce, not pity." She let that sink in, the stark, brutal honesty of it shocking the table into deeper silence. "What I find truly charitable," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength, "is our continued hospitality to guests who show such poor breeding. You came to my home, you have eaten my food and drunk my wine, all while seeking to insult me and my husband. That, Lady Beatrice, is a level of tolerance that borders on saintliness." She picked up her wineglass and took a small, deliberate sip, her eyes never leaving Lady Beatrice's face. "But even a saint's patience has its limits, and I am no saint." It was devastating. She had not raised her voice. She had not cried. She had simply taken Lady Beatrice's own weapon, the truth of her situation, and turned it against her with lethal precision. She had owned the insult, stripped it of its power, and exposed Lady Beatrice for the cruel, ill-mannered bully she was. Lady Beatrice's face, which had been flushed with wine and triumph, was now a mask of pale, sputtering fury. She was speechless. Alexander pushed back his chair and stood up. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it held the absolute authority of a man who owned every soul in the room. "I believe Lady Beatrice and her friends have had a long journey," he said. "They will be tired. They will be leaving first thing in the morning. Poole," he said to the butler, "please see that their carriage is ready at dawn." It was an expulsion, a public, unequivocal casting out. He then walked around the table to where Clara sat. He placed his hand on her shoulder, a simple public gesture of ownership and support that spoke volumes. "My wife," he said to the stunned assembly, his voice filled with a fierce, undisguised pride, "is the finest duchess this house has ever known, and I will not have her or her home disrespected." He looked down at Clara, and in his eyes she saw it all: the admiration, the respect, the dawning of a feeling so powerful it terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The spell was broken by the Dowager Duchess, who raised her glass. "To the Duchess of Blackwood," she said, her voice ringing with triumph. "A woman of substance." The rest of the table, relieved and impressed, joined the toast. Lady Beatrice sat in stunned, humiliated silence, her social execution complete. Later that night, after the guests had departed, and Lady Beatrice and her cohort had flounced off to their rooms to pack, Clara stood at the window of her bedchamber, looking out at the moonlit gardens. She was still trembling from the confrontation, a mixture of adrenaline and exhaustion coursing through her. She heard a soft knock at the connecting door, the door to Alexander's corridor, which had remained closed since her arrival. "Clara." His voice was low. "Come in," she whispered. He entered, closing the door behind him. He was no longer in his formal dinner attire, but in a simple shirt and trousers, his cravat gone, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked younger, more vulnerable. He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, though it was not entirely true. "I am tired." "What you did tonight," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "It was magnificent." She shook her head. "It was necessary. I could not let her. I would not be that girl in the ballroom again." "You were never that girl," he said fiercely. "Even then, you had more courage and dignity in your little finger than she has in her entire body." He took a step closer, closing the remaining distance between them. He reached out, his hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that spread through her entire body. "I am a fool, Clara," he whispered, his stormy eyes searching hers. "A blind, arrogant fool." "No," she breathed. "Yes, I married you for convenience, for duty. I saw you as a solution to a problem. I did not see you." He shook his head, a look of deep self-recrimination on his face. "My father's marriage was a disaster, a loveless, bitter union that destroyed my mother. She withered away in this house, a prisoner of his coldness. I swore I would never repeat his mistakes. I thought the best way to do that was to avoid emotion entirely, to make marriage a contract, safe and sterile." His voice broke. "I was so determined not to become my father that I nearly missed the greatest treasure of my life." He used the same word he had used at the ball, but this time it was not a weapon. It was a prayer. "Alexander," she whispered, her own eyes filling with tears, the tears she had refused to shed for so long. "I have been in mourning for half my life," he continued, his voice thick. "For my mother, for the man I thought I should be. This house, this life, it has been a tomb. And then you came. You opened the windows. You let the light in. You are not a prisoner here, Clara. You are its salvation. You are my salvation." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I don't deserve you. I know that. But I am a selfish man. And I will not let you go." "I don't want you to," she cried, the words a sob of relief, of joy, of 1,000 pent-up emotions. He lifted his head, his gaze burning into hers. "Clara," he breathed, his voice a raw plea. "My wife." And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and discovery, of apologies and promises. It was the breaking of a dam, the release of years of pent-up loneliness and grief and longing. It was the taste of redemption. She kissed him back, with all the fierceness in her own soul, her arms winding around his neck, pulling him closer. She was no longer the charity bride, the Duchess of Convenience. In his arms, under the light of the moon in this house she had brought back to life, she was just Clara, and he was just Alexander, and they had, against all odds, found their way home. He swept her up into his arms, his mouth never leaving hers, and carried her toward the bed. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving her face. He was asking a question, a silent, profound question, and with a smile, her first truly, genuinely happy smile since she was a girl, she gave him his answer. She reached up, her fingers tangling in his hair, and drew him down to her. The door to the past was closed. The door to the future was opening. And for the first time, they would walk through it together. The days that followed were a revelation. The world had been remade. Northwood, which had been a place of lonely duty, was now a shared paradise. The house itself seemed to sigh in relief, the old sadness replaced by the sound of laughter. Clara's laughter, which Alexander discovered was a low, musical thing that he would do anything to hear. And his own, rusty and infrequent at first, but growing more confident each day. They were inseparable. They rode out together in the mornings, Alexander pointing out the boundaries of the estate, explaining the intricacies of crop rotation and animal husbandry. Clara listened, not as a duchess being given a lesson, but as a partner. She asked intelligent questions, made sharp observations. He found himself looking at his own land with new eyes, through her eyes. They spent their afternoons in the library, a room that now felt truly theirs. They read aloud to each other, sharing passages from books they loved. He discovered her passion for poetry. She discovered his surprising knowledge of ancient history. They talked for hours, not just about books and land, but about everything. About their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. He learned about her quiet, studious girlhood, her love for her feckless father, her frustration at the limited world offered to women. She learned about his lonely boyhood in the shadow of his parents' miserable marriage, his deep love for his mother, the crushing weight of the dukedom that had been placed on his shoulders at too young an age. They were peeling back the layers, discovering the person beneath the title, the truth beneath the reputation. He was not the cold, unfeeling Duke of Blackwood. He was Alexander, a man of deep loyalty and fierce passion, a man who had locked his heart away for fear of being hurt again. And she was not the timid, downtrodden charity bride. She was Clara, a woman of formidable intelligence, quiet strength, and a capacity for joy that had been buried but never extinguished. One evening, they were walking in the rose garden after dinner. The garden was no longer overgrown. Under Clara's direction, the gardeners had pruned and weeded and coaxed it back to life. The air was heavy with the scent of 100 different blossoms. "My mother would have loved what you've done here," Alexander said, his voice soft. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It was a simple, natural gesture, and it filled her with a profound sense of peace. "She would have loved you," he added, stopping to look at her in the twilight. "You are the daughter she always wanted, strong and kind and unafraid." "I was afraid," Clara confessed, "for a very long time." "I know," he said, "and I was the cause of it. Can you ever forgive me, Clara, for the way our marriage began, for the coldness, the distance?" She brought his hand to her lips and kissed it. "There is nothing to forgive, Alexander. It was a path. It led me here. It led me to you. How can I regret the path when I love the destination so much?" His eyes shone with an emotion so deep it stole her breath. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, burying his face in her hair. "I love you," he whispered, the words he had never said to anyone, the words he had never thought he would say. "I love you more than my own life." "And I love you," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. It was the simplest, most profound truth in the world. They decided to return to London. It was Clara's idea. "We cannot hide here forever," she said one morning at breakfast. The small, round table was now their preferred spot, a symbol of their new intimacy. "The world thinks I am your charity bride, a creature you are hiding away in the country out of shame. I will not have that. I am your wife, the Duchess of Blackwood. I want to return to London on your arm, not as your acquisition, but as your partner." Alexander looked at her, a fierce pride in his eyes. He had dreaded the thought of returning to the snake pit of the Ton, but she was right. It was not a retreat. It was a reclamation. "When do we leave?" he asked, his lips curving into a smile. Their return to London was nothing short of a triumph. When their carriage pulled up to Blackwood House, the staff was assembled. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Mrs. Thorne, the stern London housekeeper, greeted them with a genuine, welcoming smile. The house, which had once felt like a cold museum, now felt like a home. Clara directed the unpacking, consulted on menus, and took her place as the true mistress of the house with a quiet, unassailable confidence. The true test, however, was their re-entry into society. They chose their moment carefully. A grand ball hosted by the powerful Lady Danbury, a woman whose approval could make or break a reputation. When they entered the ballroom, a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to them. But this time, it was different. Alexander did not walk ahead of her, a remote, solitary figure. He walked beside her, his hand possessively at the small of her back, his gaze fixed on her with an expression of such open adoration that it silenced the most vicious gossips. And Clara. Clara was transformed. She wore a gown of deep emerald green, the color of life and new beginnings. The Blackwood diamonds glittered at her throat, but they were no longer a heavyweight. They were a symbol of her station, a station she now occupied with grace and authority. She did not shrink from the stairs. She met them head-on, her chin held high, a serene, confident smile on her face. She was not the charity bride. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, and she was magnificent. They saw Lady Beatrice Finch across the room. She was holding court, but her circle seemed smaller, her audience less enthralled. When she saw Clara and Alexander, she went pale and quickly turned away. a pariah in the world she had once ruled. Her defeat was absolute. Later that evening, Alexander led Clara onto the terrace for a breath of fresh air. The cool night air was a relief after the heat of the ballroom. "Happy?" he asked, his arm circling her waist. "Perfectly," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear in the London sky. "They're all terrified of you, you know," he murmured into her hair. "Of me?" she asked, surprised. "Yes. You did not scream or cry or make a scene. You simply won. With dignity. They don't know what to do with a woman like you." "And what about you, Your Grace?" she teased. "Do you know what to do with a woman like me?" He turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face. "I know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know that you are my heart, my soul, and my home. And I know that I will love you until the day I die." He kissed her then, a long, slow, sweet kiss under the London stars, a public declaration for all the world to see. They were no longer a bargain, a contract, or a scandal. They were a love story, a quiet, resilient, and ultimately triumphant love story. Epilogue. 2 years later, the sun was warm on the lawns of Northwood. The scent of roses and freshly cut grass hung in the air. The house, once a monument to grief, was now filled with light and life. Clara sat on a blanket, spread under the shade of a great oak tree, a book open in her lap. But she wasn't reading, she was watching her husband. Alexander was down on one knee in the grass, his back to her. He was in his shirt sleeves, his dark hair ruffled by the breeze. He was holding out his finger to their son, a 1-year-old boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's stormy grey eyes. The baby, James, reached out a chubby hand and grabbed his father's finger, letting out a delighted shriek of laughter. Alexander laughed too, the rich, easy sound that was now as much a part of Northwood as the cry of the hawks in the sky. He scooped the boy up and swung him into the air, and James's squeals of joy echoed across the garden. He turned and saw Clara watching them, and his smile widened. He walked over to her, settling on the blanket beside her, the baby still cradled in his arms. "He is going to be a terror," Alexander said, his voice filled with love. "He gets it from his father," Clara replied, reaching out to stroke her son's soft cheek. James, tired from his exertions, nestled his head into his father's shoulder, and his eyes began to droop. Alexander held him close, his large hand gently patting the boy's back. They sat in comfortable, happy silence, a family. The Duke, the Duchess, and their heir. But they were so much more than their titles. They were Alexander and Clara and James. "Do you remember that first ball?" Clara asked softly. Alexander's expression sobered. "How could I forget? I was a brute." "No," she said, taking his free hand. "You were my champion. Even then. Even when you didn't know it." She looked around at the thriving garden, the vibrant house, the man beside her, the child in his arms. "It's strange," she mused. "They called me the charity bride. They thought you had saved me from ruin." "I did," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "But what no one ever knew, what even we didn't know then, was that I was saving you too." He brought her hand to his lips, his eyes, no longer stormy but clear, and filled with love, holding hers. "You did more than save me, Clara," he said. "You brought me back to life." She leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart full. The whispers of the past were long gone. replaced by the quiet, steady beat of a life built on love, respect, and the profound joy of being truly, completely seen. The quiet dignity of their love had outlasted all the loud cruelty of the world. Thank you for listening to the story, all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from, and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.